Welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast, featuring author and ministry leader Kent Evans and business executive and military veteran Lawson Brown. This is a show for you, Dad. You want to be a godly and intentional father. Unfortunately, you've turned to these two knuckleheads for help. Let us know how that works out for you. Before we begin, remember this: you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. Please welcome your hosts, Kent and Lawson.
Hey, Dad, you have caught us in the middle or toward the tail end of a series we're doing on Proverbs chapter 12. We are glad that you're with us today. We're going to be talking about our wives and how we can love and serve them well. So if you're a total slacker husband and your wife is riding in the car, you should probably turn this episode off and come back to it.
I didn't think about that.
And come back to it later when you can listen and upskill yourself with today's episode. We're super excited. Lawson, good to see you, my friend.
Hey,
fresh
man,
back from some business travel. So
yep.
I'm glad you have you on the podcast today, buddy.
Yeah. Good to see you. Glad to be back. Glad to be back home, settled. It's been a bit.
Yeah.
And it's funny you say that. I was sitting here, as always, I'm thinking about who might listen that I know. And in this particular case, April, Audrey,
her name is
good,
Audrey. Right.
Good to hear. Good for you to hear us. I hope I don't, go off track too bad, Audrey. Stick with me. I'm trying, man.
We're doing this podcast for a friend. This one is for a friend.
Yeah. How do we treat our wives?
And
then Audrey's ears perk way up.
Right. Let's just say I knew a guy who treated his wife poorly. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, I was aware of such an individual. I'm super excited. The verse we're going to talk about today is one verse out of Proverbs 12:4. We'll probably chime in with some other scripture that connects to that, of course. But Proverbs 12:4 says this: an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. Well, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
The second half of that's a little rough. To kick us off, Lawson, just so the listener to today's show is under no illusion as to my level of husband perfection, I asked April, my lovely wife, hey, we're going to be doing a podcast about wives. What should I say? And she had one really serious comment that was really cool and very insightful. And then she had another comment that was a fantastic jab at me, which was, one of those backhanded compliments. It was so good. The serious comment was, she said, well, I would put some of the wife's behavior back on the husband. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, when you're on your game spiritually, when you're in the word, when, you're living out the walking worthy, and you are, Colossians 3:2, when your mind is set on things above, not on things on the earth, when you're walking that way, it makes it a ton easier for me to be a godly wife. Like in the way she described it was, it's like I'm lifting the lid, or I'm setting a pace that makes it easy for her to run at her full speed as a wife. And so I thought that was really insightful. That
I love that. Yeah.
To some degree, I had a friend who's an elder at a church one time, and he goes, man, this may be overstated, but you show me 10 really struggling marriages, and I'll show you 9 husbands who are not on their spiritual game. And that may be overstated. And I get that there's exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, there is a direct connection to my leadership of our home, my leadership of my own spiritual walk, and then the freedom and the joy that gives April to just do her thing spiritually and not have to worry about me, which she then chased that with.
Which leads us to the second comment.
Which was so hilarious. She goes, yeah, early in our marriage, you had so many gaps in your walk, and you were so undisciplined, and you were so needy. I basically had to raise you too. And she goes, man, now that I've done all that, I can just worry about raising our boys, which I thought was fantastic.
And I feel you, April. I feel you.
I said, thank you. Like, should I say thank you? But she meant it as a compliment for sure, that now I'm, I can lead more spiritually now than I could 30 years or 29 years ago when we got married. And so to that end, I told her, I said, I'm like Pinocchio. One day I'll become a real boy. I'll grow, I'll actually become a real boy. But that was what April's comment was, man. And I appreciate her wisdom on that, because she's right. Often, an excellent wife is a wife that can, her excellence can either be like, she can do it the hard way or she can do it the easy way. And the hard way is when she's got to be excellent in the midst of a lot of husband drama. The easy way is when she's got to be excellent, but in the midst of a more symbiotic and healthy and fruitful relationship with her husband.
Yeah, it's a double burden, on the wife to have to carry both loads. And so, guys as dads, when we're not doing our part, it makes it that much harder. And I think generally speaking, women have proven to be more relational. So they are kind of this relational glue of the family in a lot of ways. And when that's being, hindered or diluted by some inability of us, or, some lack of focus, or like you said, some lack of discipline in our daily walk, it does take a little bit of discipline, and but it's also when our connection, when we have a disconnection, they feel that relationally, our wives feel that disconnection that we may have with both God and with them. Usually you can trace it back. If you have a disconnection with your kids, you're finding it hard to connect, you're finding it hard to keep the relationship rich and strong with your kids or with your wife. You can trace that back and land on, are you connected spiritually and, with your faith? And then, I think there's this combination of, like, in our relationship with our wives, we are reflecting one another to a degree. But if you think about God as like this light that might be shining into our marriage, we're reflecting that light between each other.
Yeah.
And when our reflector, our lens is not pointed at that light as the dad, as the husband, we're not receiving it to therefore then help pass it on, and
oh, that's great.
So I really resonate with what she's saying. It's a whole lot easier for the wife to be on her game when we are on our husband game.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and in that light, there was a time, just in the last week, when I did something that was offensive to April, and we were in kind of a public setting, and she let it ride and didn't, call me out right in public. But after we got out of public, she just goes, "Hey, by the way, the way you handled that thing, made me feel," and she kind of listed some things, and I felt terrible because I was insensitive, and I was apparently critical. Like, I was critical of her in a public way, or I was kind of poking fun in a way that was not healthy and not wise. And it was just a really bad husband moment. Right. And I would say two things about that. One is after the event, the takeaway was I felt good to the degree that she felt okay bringing that up to me. Like, she was like, I know
that's where you felt good. That's where it stopped.
Not exactly. However, my first reaction was I felt ashamed and sorrowful and, repentant. I was like, I am so sorry. That's not what I meant, and so forth. And so, that was kind of step one. But as I look back, I'm like, man, I'm glad that, she felt safe enough to bring it up. Like, she knew I don't like people to call me out. Like, who does, right? Who wants to be told, hey, you did that wrong? But I'm getting better and better as I get older of seeing the value in that and listening to it and controlling my visceral reaction, which is to be defensive. I think anybody, I just was reading a book called Sacred Pace, and the author was talking about giving advice to our adult children when it's unsolicited. And the way he phrased it was, any unsolicited feedback to an adult is dangerous business. And I thought that was great. And so the difference in marriage ought to be with our wives is it's not unsolicited, right? It is permanently solicited.
Yeah,
like,
that's right.
Open door. If I'm a jerk, if I'm hateful, if I'm being rude, if I'm being angry, I don't need to tell you once a day, you have the freedom to give me that kind of feedback. That's an ongoing blank check, no problem. Now, I still react sometimes. My blood pressure might go up when the feedback is given, but I think I'm getting to a place where I at least hear it and I'm like, okay, I can take that
Yeah.
to heart.
Yeah. I also think there are times when we ought to have a moment, like sit down and, hey, how am I doing? How do you feel? What's going on between you and me, and what can I do better? One of the cross reference scriptures is Ephesians 5:25-33. I won't read the entire thing. It's a little bit long, but in verse 31, I learned this earlier on in our marriage, but not, we had been married for a little while. It says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Like, I heard that in our marriage ceremony, but it didn't become real in my heart until something went down within our family. And it wasn't, I don't want to be overly dramatic, it wasn't like I had to choose between my wife, and my family before we had kids. But it was a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion, and I had to, put a foot down and really kind of choose a side for the moment. And I made it really clear that there is no choice. It's my wife. And like, we come together, we become one. There's no undoing that. And so that was one that stuck out, and I would love to get your thought on that. But then it starts, that Ephesians 5:25-33 starts with husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. And then I bolded, and gave himself up for her. So that is, to me, that is like big, bold, all caps. Do not take that lightly. You give yourself up. Yourself is given away, is given up. You give it back, and we've got some notes in here in the show notes that I really like about, like you said, it's kind of a pet peeve maybe of yours to say happy wife, happy life. That's the opposite of giving yourself up for your wife.
Man, it's one of those topics where it's like, please get me up on the soapbox. And and then at the same time, it's a topic where I'm like, don't get me started, because I will go for an hour and a half. So buckle up. If you say that phrase very often, I don't know when you're listening to this. Okay. I know we're recording it in March of 2024. But whenever you're listening to it, look at your calendar right now. Notice the date, whenever it is that you're listening to this, and make today the last day in your life you ever say that phrase. Like, go backward and go, okay, if I've said it 1,000 times, super, today's your day when you never, ever say that phrase again. Like, okay, write us, email us, tell us what your date was when you stopped saying such a foolish, boorish, moronic statement as happy wife, happy life. Because
you feel a bit strongly about this, by the way. You said you could go on for an hour and a half. I looked at my watch. We're now at 47 seconds. So
good. So we've only got 1 hour and 29 minutes left. Because here's the heart of that. And I get it. Okay. It's a colloquialism, like, if you don't like the weather around here, stick around, it'll change. Like, I understand that sometimes we use catchphrases to be silly and fun, and I'm the king of goofing off. And so, okay, if you've said it jokingly, you're still a moron, but I understand why you did it. But here's the undercurrent. Here's what that communicates to your wife. When you say happy wife, happy life, is she is a child. She is a baby. And what you're going to do is just make her happy so she doesn't cry, so you can get some sleep. Like, that's how you're talking to your wife. That's how you're talking about your wife. Secondly, if you look at it, it's a very, very self-centered kind of logic that would undergird that statement. Because what I'm saying is, I really want a happy life. Here, I want something out of this marriage, and I'm going to use her like a tool to get what I want. It's a statement about, like, exploitation, basically. Like, I mean, bro, I can't tell you how much that statement drives me batty, because here, bottom line, I'm called to serve my wife. I'm called to lay down my life for her, as you point out in Ephesians. not to have her make me complete or have her make me happy. That is not her job. Her job is to love me and to respect me and to let me lead. But insofar as I'm following Christ, I can make that more or less difficult on her. So like, okay, Dad, if you've ever said the phrase happy wife, happy life, congratulations, you're now done. You can now, like Pinocchio and me, you can grow up and be a real boy and never say that phrase again, because it's demeaning and it's self-centered in its nature, in the real phrase. And it puts your wife in this position of like, well, if she's unhappy, then
That's
I'm
what I
just
was going to say. Yeah.
Come on. You know,
It's almost always said in this context of like, well, you know, if I don't, you know, my life would be, you know, awful. And so, yeah, you're right. It's the opposite of selflessness.
Well, and I look at, as you and I talked before we got on today's show, marriage is the picture of the gospel. And I don't mean like just the human marriage. I mean, that's Jesus said he was the bridegroom and the church was the bride. Can you imagine Jesus sitting around with his 12 apostles, you know, and he leans back with his arms and his elbows out and his head in his hands and goes, yeah, you know, happy church, happy God, you know, and you're like, what is he talking about? Like, This doesn't make any sense. And so for us, our intent in loving our wife is not just to love our wives well, to set a good example for our kids, to be a good example for our community, to be a role model. It's not just that. It's not just that. It is that we are showing a picture of the gospel to the world. Like this is one of the primary metaphors Jesus used to describe his relationship to the church, was that of a bridegroom to the bride. And so I was reading the other day in a book study I'm doing from Precept Ministries, which I love Precept Ministries. If you're looking to be a Bible student, go to precept.org. I love those guys, man, do amazing, amazing work. And I'm reading a book that Kay Arthur wrote 20, 30 years ago about the names of God. And in the book, she talks about God getting glory. And she says the Hebrew words that describe the word glory are to give an accurate and consistent picture of. So when we say we're giving God glory, we are rightly reflecting back to him who he really is. And so she went on to say, so when we model God to the world and we quote unquote give him glory, we're trying to give the world a really accurate picture of who God is. Well, the best place we get to do that is in our marriages.
Right.
It's the one thing. You can do it at work. You can do it in the pulpit. You can do it on the podcast. You can do it as a dad. There's lots of places you can do it. But man, one of the primary places we can do it is in our marriage. So I want to help a dad today break the bondage of thinking that his marriage is about his happiness. I want you to be happy as a husband. Like I really do. Yeah. I'm a very, very, very happy husband. Like my life is extremely full. Having said that, that's a byproduct. It's a byproduct of serving my wife like Christ loved the church. It's a byproduct. It's not the end goal.
Yeah. And if you think about what service means, I love how Jesus set that example of, you know, he sought out people and went straight to them when he felt a need. And it was him giving himself. It was him going to interact with someone in a way that would change them and bring them closer to him. And so a servant-focused husband, which it's not easy, you know, I mean, it's failure after failure of trying. But when you get it right, and when you know that you're living out what Jesus modeled for us, and him setting the example, him dying for other people, for all of us, and you know, he didn't go and do something, whether it was perform a miracle or just spend time and go love on someone, and then turn around to Matthew and go, hey, you got that right? You recorded that one? Because I might need a favor down the road.
Write this one down.
Right. Capture it, Matthew, because what I want to do is make sure that if I've given them something, that I'm going to get it back in return in equal measure. And Audrey and I had a conversation years and years ago about trying to trying to outdo the other
Mm.
without recording what you're doing. Like don't get hung up on. There was an early time in our marriage where I was kind of keeping score, frankly. I was like, oh, I feel like my credit, balance is just overfilled with things that I'm doing, and I'm not getting chits back in return. Like, when is this going to begin to pay off? And
How about a little something, for the effort?
right.
To quote Bill Murray from Caddyshack.
So, but when you are so unconcerned
Yeah.
with what you're getting that you just are doing, you're just
Right.
doing for the other person, you're just serving the other person, you're just putting their needs first. You are thinking about them so much so that you're not even worried about
Yeah.
yourself. That is, like, it's not 50-50. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting is there's a couple paradigms of marriage that I think guys have heard over the years, and I'd like to introduce one that I don't hear enough of. Now, I'm not the inventor. I think scripture is the inventor. But to your point, some people look at marriage as 50-50, right? I'm going to do my part, you do your part, together we're a whole thing. And I think we've all heard over the years that's probably a flawed way to look at it, because we're both giving half effort. What good is that, right? And I understand the psychology of why we would call it, if you're
Yeah.
both giving equal, it could be 20-20.
Yeah.
The other way I've heard it described is no, a marriage isn't 50-50. It's 100-100. It's both of us giving all of our effort. That's better. I think that's a better picture, is that April gives 100% effort at being a godly wife and serving me. I give 100% effort at being a godly husband, serving her. That's a better picture. But I think there's a third picture that's a bit more scripturally on point. And for a husband, the marriage could be 100-0 proposition. And here's what I mean. As Jesus was dying on the cross for the bride he came here to save, who turned on him and murdered him, as this was happening, not a month later, not after some therapy, not after he found himself, not after he resolved it, in the moment, he was saying, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And the parallel or the correlation I draw to my marriage is I am called to give 100% sacrificial service to April, even if she does absolutely nothing in return. In fact, even if she's trying to poke me with a pitchfork, I'm still called to love. Now I may have to put some boundaries up, take the pitchfork away, save the children, but there's a part of me that says, man, I think the right way to think about marriage as a husband is not 50-50, not 100-100, but kind of like 100-0 or 100 blank or 100 infinity. Mm-hmm. My job is to do my job and not to do it so that there's a corresponding credit for every debit.
Yeah, it's not an if then. It's not a and I did that, frankly, earlier on in our marriage. I felt like if I'm doing 100
earlier on, like last week.
Right. Well, occasionally, yeah.
Audrey talked to me long ago, aka 14 days.
Yeah, it's certainly like not like I conquered this, and but I do feel relieved more than I did way back then, because it's a burden to carry around this. All right, I feel like I'm doing 100, and you're doing maybe 50, 60. Yeah. So I'm going to back myself down, and I'm going to wait, and I'm going to see, does that change, and maybe you start giving more. I mean, I'm just being honest. That's kind of how I had thought and felt way back then. Yeah. And that's like, dude, it just gets old and it's heavy. Yeah. It's like you're always looking for what are you doing here? Man. I just did something, and now I'm waiting. I'm waiting on you to have noticed it, recognize it, maybe respond. Yeah, like that's a lot to carry around.
We've seen different Greek words for love in the New Testament. Phileo and all these different words. And the one that's kind of the penultimate word, the big one, is agape, right?
Yeah.
And we usually translate it as like unconditional love. And if you think about that, if that's a good translation, probably is, then therefore my love for April, my behaviors, my words, the way I spend our money, our time, how many times I'll go down to the lobby and get her a cup of tea when we're on a trip, whatever, those things should have no conditions. unconditional, right? And I can't imagine, of the thousands of dads who are listening to this podcast right now, I'll bet you all of us have done things for our wives so that we get something in return. Either she gets off my back, she quits griping about this, or she doesn't spend money on that, or we have a reward in the bedroom or whatever. Like there's something that we think, man, if I serve her really well, then I'll get to,
she's going to notice it. And then, guess what I'm going to get?
Right. I'll spend a few hours shopping with you, so you get off my case about golfing every Saturday or whatever. Like there's some trade in our head. But unconditional love would say, I'm just going to love you, full stop, even if you hate me, right? Even if you hate, and most of us aren't in that spot. Like, I mean, your wife isn't trying to crucify you literally, but Jesus' wife did. Jesus' bride crucified him. And as it was happening, like sometimes I won't get on the whole topic of forgiveness.
No, you're right though. Yeah.
He had basically pre-forgiven them. If you think about it theologically, it's not like they sinned against him and he's like, oh, this is a big one. This is going to take some time. I have to get over this. And I'm not trying to minimize the hurt people do to us. That's not my objective. What I am saying is, if we look to Christ as our model man, as I do, then I think where we're trying to go, or where we're trying to get, is that state of, I just can't be offended. I almost cannot be offended. In fact, what's funny, gosh, just this morning, Lawson, I was texting a good friend of mine. I had sent him a bit of a snarky email about something. And right after I sent it, I was like, I shouldn't send emails after 9 p.m. at night. Like, that's just a rule I should follow. And secondly, I was just a bit snarky, and I texted him and said, man, I'm sorry. I was a smart aleck. Would you please forgive me? And he sent me back a note and said, man, don't worry about it. He said, I'm so aware of my own pride. I'm totally unoffendable, which I thought was a great line, right? It's a great line.
That is so good. Yeah. I like that.
He said, I'm so aware of my own pride. He said, I'm practically unoffendable, which I thought was a great line. And as a husband, that's the guy I want to be. I want to be the guy who does not, keep a record of wrongs. I heard a preacher last weekend preaching on 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. And he said, we are record keepers. We are record keepers. Our brains keep records. He goes, but if you want to love somebody really well, be a keeper of a record of rights. Don't keep a record of wrongs, but do keep a record of rights.
Good.
Wouldn't that just transform most of our marriages if we just said, man, here's all I'm going to do. I'm going to let the wrongs float on by and let them, fall into the abyss of forgottenness. And I'm going to let all the rights, I'm going to store those up. And I'm going to keep a good list of all the things my wife has done to love me well, because it's really, really, really long.
Man, the first two of these that we've kind of broken it down. Number one, selflessness, and number two, service, servanthood, servant mindset. Here's what I would just love to picture overhearing one of the girls, one of my daughters talking about me to someone, just saying, God, my dad he loves my mom so much. Like, it's evident in what he does, and if I can fast forward to, that day of imagining that comes true, it will be because I modeled this selflessness in the way that I treat her, and the way that I am so focused on her that I am unoffendable in what I'm missing. Or in that my servant mindset is all about her without a record keeping of what I'm getting back. I'm not keeping a ledger that needs to balance. I'm trying to think of the counterweight. I'm trying to have mine so full on this right side, I don't even notice that there is such thing as a scale. I'm just putting stuff on.
For the business guy out there, the balance sheet should have all assets, no liabilities.
There you go. Right on. Yep. And all in her favor. But you put something that I want to clarify. It's the third, if we're doing these in S's, selfless, serve, and then sanctify. Explain a bit about, I know that sanctity in a marriage, and when we are looking for the I guess in our marriage, that we are the ones who are helping bring sanctification. It's not on us. I'm not saying that. We're not God, but we have a part, I guess is what I would say, in our marriage being truly doing that, 1 + 1 = 1.
Yeah, I look at the verse, like, for example, and most guys who listen to this, if you have any kind of Bible history, but you'll know the word sanctification is real prevalent in the New Testament. And it basically means the ongoing process of us becoming more and more shaped into the image of Christ. So, you're saved instantly, but you're sanctified progressively.
Right.
And so over time, your character is shaped. Your identity changes in a moment, in a flash. You go from lost to saved. The identity is a 1-0. It's an on-off switch. It's binary. Your character is more developmental, and you got, bits and pieces that need to grow and shape, and your character should be ever growing. Your identity should be fixed. And so in the area of sanctification, I need to become more like Christ. And for guys listening, that for you to become more patient and kind, all you need is for your life to have a bunch of things go really slowly and for people to treat you badly. And you got abundant opportunities to learn how to be patient and kind. And they're called children. That's what they're called. And so we all experience that, where we realize, man, the sandpaper of life makes me smooths out my rough edges. And we know that's true about our relationship with God. Like, so 1 Thessalonians 5:23 says, now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's a big theological statement made in 1 Thessalonians 5:25. Or John 17:17 says, sanctify them in the truth. Jesus is talking, and he says, sanctify, set them apart, have them continue to grow. Your word is truth. That's why God's word soaking through our spirit makes us more and more like Christ, or through sanctification by the spirit and the truth. 2 Thessalonians 2 says. So this principle of us being sanctified is a work that God is doing on our spirit and in our lives. One of the ways he has used, one of the methods he's used in my life is my wife, in the process of me becoming sanctified. And so, for example, when we were first married, there were things you would probably describe me as being more spontaneous and more willing to take risks. And my wife is a little less spontaneous and a little more thoughtful, for example, in how we handled money, for example. And so I would just spend and not be wise at all. She would be more frugal and more disciplined. Well, sometimes I would be like, hey, live a little, like lighten up. And that was kind of my attitude was, you are wrong and my approach is right. You need to be more like me. But frankly, in that area, especially like, for example, our early marriage, her financial acumen, she was way more financially responsible than me. Well, that made me offended. I felt exposed, and I felt foolish over time, because I was like, wow, this lady knows way more about how to manage money than I do. My knee-jerk reaction to that is to push against it. However, what I've learned is I should embrace it, because she's in a more wise position, and her nuances, her character strengths will pull me to center. Like, it will make me a better person, like literally make me a better person. On our board at Manhood Journey, we have a guy on the board who's more cautious and thoughtful, measures his words very carefully, and is probably a little more, not pessimistic, but he's a little more just like really conservative, ultra conservative. I don't mean theologically. I mean, just money spending, hiring, the whole bit. I'm probably a little more aggressive and opportunistic and optimistic and mouthy, and I say more than I should, and he says less. Somewhere in the middle, I think, is one of the things that has helped ballast and balance our ministry, is because I've embraced and appreciated the fact that he is different than me. Where I used to think everybody ought to be more like me, now I'm kind of like, shoot, when I'm around people who are different than me, that's an opportunity. And I bet you we're talking to thousands of husbands right now who, if I said, hey man, think about one thing that your wife does better than you, it's more godly, it's more wise, it's more responsible, it's more on point than you. And I'll bet you there's been times in your marriage where you resented that and it frustrated you. Well, let's get in the club called I love the things about my wife that are more nuanced and different than me, because probably it's God working as a sanctifying agent through my wife to make me more like Christ.
Bro, well said. That's good stuff. I was imagining, and part of it may be that, Audrey is a different person than me. She likes different things. She is a creative, person, and I'm probably a little more on the less creative, more get it done kind of side. And she's like fun and funky and has a good time and, laughs a lot and keeps this family grounded. But that's different than what you're saying from a character standpoint. This is not, we need various personalities, like in our little family of 4, each person contributes in a different way, their personality, and it's, we mixed together are what makes this family who we are, right? Each person brings a little bit of their own spice or whatever. That's different, I think, what you're saying than the character that is being received in our marriage through our wives to us as guys, and recognizing those differences is, if we don't, I don't think we'll reach where we're trying to go, like take the time and take the opportunity to think about it and realize, where does my wife strengthen me in my faith? And I think have that conversation, dude, because if you just think it and don't share it, I think we're missing out on some portion of this sanctification.
Absolutely. Well, Dad, we hope today's episode has been as encouraging to you as it is to me and Lawson, because sometimes we're on this podcast as if we've got it all figured out and as if we have all the answers. But what we know is we're sharing with you our life lessons and what we think. But more importantly, we're sharing with you what we think God thinks. And here's what God says in Proverbs 12:4: an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. So here's our challenge to you as we wrap up today's episode. Either go tell your wife that she is like rottenness in your bones and she had better get her act together. Like, that's door number 1. Or, I don't recommend that door, by the way. Door number 2, go tell your wife she's an excellent wife, because probably she is. If nothing else, she puts up with you. So go tell your wife that she is an excellent wife. Lay it out for her. Tell her Proverbs 12:4 reminded you of how excellent she is and how grateful you are to have an excellent wife. Send her a text message, put a Post-it note on her steering wheel, something. Let her know that you view her as an excellent wife and not like rottenness in your bones. And we'll see you next week as we go to episode 6 of our walk through Proverbs chapter 12. Hey, Dad, thank you for listening to today's show. If you found this episode helpful, remember, you can get all the content and show notes at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. And if you really liked it, please consider doing 3 things. Number 1, share this podcast with someone. You can hit the share button in your app, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just call a person up and tell them to listen in. Number 2, subscribe to this podcast so you get episodes automatically. That helps us as well to help dads find the show. You can do that through your favorite listening app, whatever that is. And finally, review this podcast. Leave us a review, good or bad, wherever you listen. Those reviews also help other dads find the show. You can always learn more about what we're up to at manhoodjourney.org or fatheronpurpose.org. We will see you next week.